Ladies and gentlemen, I am the American SpyFox. It's been a while. Thanks for being patient with me. I got something a little different for you today. We're going to be talking about Dave Grohl, BC, before Cobain, and leading up to Cobain, and a little bit after Cobain. We're going to be talking about Dave's story, the luckiest musician to ever exist, in my opinion.
Everywhere I go, everywhere I turn, I see this fucking face!
Not trying to take away from his talent, but clearly there's also a shit ton of luck involved, and some friends of his, some unknown people who helped him along the way. So this video is really for them. It's for the faces behind the man that don't get recognized for the help that they gave him when he was down on his luck and he really, really needed it. Let it be a lesson, everybody. No successful person gets there on their own. As the old saying goes, behind every successful man is a woman who took a lot of shit. And in this case, it's several women. Ha ha, piqued your interest, didn't I? You don't know about the ladies.
A dancer, like stripper, I guess.
That helped Dave Grohl get to where he is. We're going to be talking about them later in the video. I have included several clips from different interviews with Dave and Chris Novoselic, podcasts, TV shows, radio. As usual, my sources will be linked in the description below, so you know that I'm not just blowing smoke up your ass. A quick shout out to all the channel members and patrons who support the American SpyFox channel, and then we will begin with the story I've written for you today. Dave Grohl, the luckiest musician alive.
Check, 1, 2, check. Check, 1, 2. Check, 1, 2, check.
In a 2018 interview with Joe Rogan, Smashing Pumpkins vocalist Billy Corgan, who has studied both sides of the music industry, one as a successful artist and two as a corporate investor.
As you say, you're business savvy.
Yeah, I love the business. I think.
Say that again.
I love the business.
Corgan estimated that out of the tens of thousands of rock bands trying to make it to the mainstream in the 90s, only about 10% of them would actually be signed to major labels. And of that 10%, Corgan guessed that maybe 3 to 5% of that original 10% would make it big with mainstream success. You cannot fathom how many bands are out there that these major labels signed, but for whatever reason, they just never became a household name. In my little town alone, I can think of 2 bands, one signed to Sony, one signed to RCA, that never made it. The first being a band that my high school band would open up for, the Spyvies, who were signed to Sony. We weren't opening up for them because we were such a great high school band. My guitarist's older sister was a Spyvies groupie. The second band, 700 Miles, signed to RCA. And then actually yet a third band that did achieve some success, if you're a metalhead, only within the metal community.
Beyond the permafrost.
Skeleton Witch, which was signed to Prosthetic Records, a subsidiary of Metal Blade. My point, a guy from nowhere, Ohio, can name 3 bands that he had personal relationships with or links to who were signed by major labels, and you probably have never heard of them. Oh wait, there's yet another band that was signed to a major label that I'm linked to. Lovesick Radio. They had a hit back in 2008 that entered the pop charts called
Now he's running through the line. He's trying to catch her before she's gone. Roma waiting by the phone. She's not afraid, just to be alone.
boys don't matter. I was asked to be their drummer. I declined because I had started a family. During the time that I jammed with the guys in Lovesick Radio at the Sonic Lounge in Columbus, Ohio, a famous recording studio, yet another band,
Bury me with my guns on, so when I'm cast out of the sky, I can shoot the devil right between the eyes.
Boba Flex, was recording their album, their record at the time, in another studio while we were there jamming, and I found out that the owner of the Sonic Lounge had recorded such acts as Van Halen and Guns N' Roses, 21 Pilots, another great band out of Ohio. There were so many bands in every state across the United States throughout the 90s and early 2000s that you could go to any small town, talk to somebody who's into music, and they're going to know someone who's in a band who almost made it, almost became a household name. Everybody wanted to be a rock star. In essence, making it in the rock world is akin to winning the lottery. The odds are stacked against you. It's no wonder that David Eric Grohl is looked upon as somewhat of an enigma, an exception to the rule. Now, clearly there's talent involved, but for one person to make it in the mainstream world, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and to be nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice is almost unheard of. It is unprecedented. First, he became the luckiest drummer in the world, Kurt Cobain's drummer, the last drummer of a long line of excellent drummers, any one of whom could have become that lucky guy. But it wasn't them, it was Dave Grohl.
He just never left.
Shortly after Cobain's passing, only about 8 months after his passing, Dave would start to record again what would become the Foo Fighters, where he would yet again be graced with mainstream success. And then guess what? 3rd time's a charm, back to drumming with the mega trippy desert rock band Queens of the Stone Age. And get this, is Grohl some kind of prophet? Because the latter of the 3, back in a 1992 Nirvana interview on MTV, Grohl would predict the future of grunge music and the band that he would eventually make famous.
Well, the funny thing is that the future of grunge music is now evolving from Palm Springs, California. A band named Kyuss, K-Y-U-S-S, which is the album of 1992. It's called Blues for the Red Sun, and it cannot be beaten.
Dave tells us about a band out of Palm Springs, California named Kyuss. Kyuss would go on to form Queens of the Stone Age. Josh Holmes' first band was Kyuss. So David Eric Grohl, this phenom, knew the future of grunge music long before grunge fans did. Think about the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of musicians who have blooded, sweated, and teared their way into modest success, and this guy predicts his own success. And let's not forget how many musicians in the world can say that one of the Beatles inducted them into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
And I mean, it's not just any Hall of Fame. It's the fucking Rock and Roll.
Yet still, he tries to remain modest. Dave wants to be the nice guy of rock. We know he has a lavish lifestyle. We know he has hundreds of millions. Courtney Love loves to talk about how much money Dave Grohl spends.
His mother's a banker. His father's a stockbroker. He's making $5 million a show. He's in the Foo Fighters, making a fortune. Why the fuck then does he have a Nirvana Inc. credit card and I don't? And last week he bought an Aston Martin on it.
Yet he still tries to remain modest. He wants to be the nice guy of rock and roll. He just wants to be a normal guy, even though he knows he's not. Within Dave's new tell-all book, The Storyteller, and the marketing that he did for that book, Dave is quick to remind fans of a time when he supposedly couldn't even afford to feed himself.
And it was hard, you know, it was really hard for me to leave my buddies and join this new band of strangers. I hadn't met Nirvana when I first joined the band. I just flew up there.
He just never left.
Fucking moved in with Kurt in this tiny little apartment, and now I'm surviving on 3 corn dogs a day.
The truth is, David Eric Grohl in Scream knew hard times, but by the time he made it to Nirvana, he'd never had it so good. Kurt and Chris were already well on their way.
He just never left. And he moved in with Kurt in that apartment down Pear Street.
Pear Street, right.
Yeah.
Now, were those guys working jobs? They must have been, right? At the time, or no?
I think we were making enough money for playing, and like rent was like maybe $300 a month.
They say that history is written by the victors, but with social media, plenty of people can write history. And although Dave Grohl has went on numerous podcasts, numerous interviews, claiming that this period between leaving Scream and joining Nirvana was like the lowest point of his life and he was so down and out, it's not the truth. The real story is not sad. The real story isn't even punk rock. The real story is much more interesting than the story Dave spins to be family friendly and PC and have everybody love him on podcasts and during interviews. The real story is that there was a group of women and a couple close friends looking out for Dave Grohl every step of the way. You could very easily make the argument that if it was not for these women and this one true friend that he had at one point, Dave Grohl would have never met Kurt Cobain, and therefore never became a millionaire at the point in his life he did, and therefore not have the capital to put up to start these totally new bands, to market them on your own, to tour without worrying about making money. Being in Nirvana supplied Dave with so much money that he could start any number of bands and not even have to worry about making a dime. He is totally self-sufficient, does not have to depend on record companies.
I used to be friends with Dave Grohl. I knew Dave when he was in a long time ago, when he was in a band called Scream. So I was friends with Dave for a long time before. Let's just say before he could buy cars with a credit card. I knew Dave BC, before credit and before Cobain.
So hold up a second. As we're going to learn very soon, Buzz Osborne had everything to do with Dave Grohl getting into Nirvana. So I wanted to know, how did Dave Grohl become friends with Dale Crover and Buzz Osborne, who are these legendary icons, these grandpappies of grunge? And what about that group of women I was talking about that also assisted Dave? To understand where they all fit in, we have to go back to the beginning of Dave Grohl's musical story. Often, while marketing something, you want to remain as PC as possible. So on TV shows, radio broadcasts, and podcasts, you're not going to say anything too unfamily friendly. But within books, celebrities often will open up more and give us more details about their lives. So I'm relying on Dave's own words within his book. So let's read a little from Dave's book to get the real story. And for you younger single men out there, and for you ladies who also like ladies, don't be surprised if after you hear this story, you look at a picture of Dave Grohl and think, that lucky son of a... Dave's incredible journey began in high school. The son of a very well-loved and respected public school teacher, Virginia Grohl, Dave was an unfocused, fidgety student who often turned his assignments in late or not at all. His obsessive yearning to play loud music overrode any desire to succeed under the fluorescent droning of a classroom. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the Republican businessman his news writer father, James Harper Grohl, wished him to be was a pipe dream, and Dave knew he would never live up to his father's expectations. At 16, Dave confronted both parents, by this time divorced, accompanied by his high school guidance counselor, with his wish to drop out of school, join a hardcore punk rock band, and attempt to earn a living as a professional musician. By the time Scream drummer Kent Stax left the band due to his girlfriend's pregnancy and his eagerness to be a full-time father, opening the door for Dave to step in and fill his shoes. Scream had obtained some underground notoriety and thousands of loyal fans. Often, members of more well-known punk bands like Minor Threat and Fugazi could be found within the crowd at Scream shows in DC. Scream had already made a name for themselves and had connections throughout the US, UK, and European punk rock circuits. As a public school teacher, Mother Virginia had seen kids who were very clearly bright and intelligent struggle to fit into the mold of public school perfection. So she gave her son David a pass, along with her blessing and the afterthought, "You'd better be good." Father James Harper Grohl, however, was not so thrilled. He was a typical DC Republican type of businessman who imagined a more bureaucratic future for his son. He did, however, share with Dave a desire to make music, himself being a talented musician. James Harper Grohl, Dave's father, just thought of music as a hobby, not an actual career choice to earn a decent living. Flanked by his father and his high school guidance counselor, they would go on to predict for Dave a hopeless life forecast full of despair and poverty, filling gas tanks or shining shoes at the airport. His father and the guidance counselor would try to scare him into submission. However, all Dave really needed was his mother's permission, and they could see that they weren't going to win with Virginia. She'd already made up her mind to allow him to quit school, and they reluctantly signed for Dave to drop out of high school. Soon after, Dave would see his father driving around in a new Plymouth Velour, a most pimp-ass ride. He assumed his father had withdrawn the college fund set aside for him to immediately blow on this car. After all, that college fund would have been squandered anyway. Dave often described his mother as the best woman on the planet, so her blessing was all he really wanted or needed. So Dave drops out of high school, but he's not totally irresponsible. He does get a job. He says he worked at a loading dock for a furniture store. He does this by day, Scream rehearsals by night, preparing for that first big tour. The band spent months with Dave honing in their new drummer to the chaotic yet controlled Scream sound. They also began writing new material in which they would debut as the new lineup on July 25th, 1987. By then, David turned 18, could purchase his own passport, travel alone, and even buy his own cigarettes, in which he quickly learned was a huge splurge if he wanted to also eat that day. Dave took off to Europe, touring with Scream, sleeping on couches, floors, in the van, and eating whatever scraps of food they could get their hands on. Often, each member would spend their days per diem on one thing. Dave would buy lettuce, Franz would buy carrots, Skeeter might buy broccoli, and Pete some shredded cheese. They'd mix all their goodies up in a bag that would become everyone's dinner. Remember, Scream is on a record label, Discord Records, and they are allotted a certain amount of money each day while they are out on tour to survive. In case you're wondering what that per diem was, their budget for the band was $7.50 a day each. That sounds like a ridiculously low amount of money to survive on each day, but this was the late 80s. I recall even in the late 90s, you could get a candy bar, a can of pop. That's what we call soda in Ohio, by the way. I don't think anybody else calls it that. A can of soda pop and a pack of smokes for less than $5. That was in the late 90s. So I imagine the late 80s, $7.50 a day wasn't too terrible. All the hard work and sacrifice paid off. Dave recorded one studio album and 2 live albums with Scream, who quickly blossomed into one of America's most explosive hardcore acts. Everything seemed to be going their way. They were making connections all over the world, including befriending members Dale Crover and Buzz Osborne of the Melvins. How David Eric Grohl became Dave Grohl, a trusted and respected friend of these two icons, is a short story within itself. Dave had heard the Melvins' guitarist, vocalist Buzz Osborne, aka King Buzzo, had a fondness for old Elvis Presley songs. While Scream was on tour in Memphis, Dave purchased an Elvis Presley postcard and somehow got Elvis's uncle, Vester Presley, to autograph it. David Grohl then does the smartest thing he's probably ever done. He mails it to the Melvins fan club for Buzz, a gift. Why does he do this? Well, making the right connections in the rock world often involved a heartfelt, sentimental offering, much like when Courtney Love handed Dave Grohl a heart-shaped box full of seashells to give to Kurt Cobain. Just ask Canadian radio DJ and music historian Nardwar. Look at how far offering nostalgic gifts has taken his career. On the postcard, Dave asked Buzz and Dale if they'd attend a Scream show coming up in San Francisco. By this time, the Melvins had long said goodbye to the damp and musty life of Aberdeen and made their home turf in the Bay Area.
And then we drove north and go, let's go see Buzz and Dale in San Francisco.
Was that when they lived next to Anton LaVey's
2 blocks
house?
away.
Yeah.
He was, and it was Lori Black's house. It was Lori Black's mom's mom's house. I know Buzz lived there.
Lori Black, who Chris is referring to, is the youngest daughter of Shirley Temple. However, more importantly to the story and more importantly to us fans, Lori Black became the bassist of the Melvins. Buzz and Dale were renting the home from Lori's mother, Shirley Temple. When David Grohl arrives in San Francisco along with fellow Scream bandmates Pete Stahl, Franz Stahl, and Skeeter, they discover they're on the same bill as the Melvins. Scream is actually opening up for the Melvins, and they get a chance to finally meet in person. Having received this nostalgic offering from David Eric Grohl, Buzz invites him into the Melvins' inner circle with open arms, and when Buzz and Dale introduce Dave to all of their inner circle, they simply refer to him as, "This is Dave Grohl." Thus, David Eric Grohl becomes Dave Grohl. Prior to his interactions with Buzz Osborne and Dale Crover, everyone had referred to him as David. And at this point in time, Dave Grohl could have never guessed how life-changing that gift, that offering, would be for him in the coming months. So Scream sticks around San Francisco for a couple weeks because they have more shows to play in the Bay Area. Coincidentally, Chris Novoselic and Kurt Cobain would be coming up from LA to visit Buzz in San Francisco at this time. The reason Chris and Kurt were in LA? They were being wined and dined by the major labels. Kurt and Chris had made a demo tape that got out into the wild, even some radio stations got some bootlegs, and the major labels were going nuts over the new songs that Kurt Cobain had written. It's worth mentioning that this is also the point in time when Susan Silver, Soundgarden and Alice in Chains manager, heard the tapes, contacted Cobain, hooked them up with an attorney named Alan Mintz, who protected Kurt Cobain's intellectual property during this gray period where they're not signed, but everybody wants them.
So we'd go there, and then we found another motel to stay in, and like Buzz is like, you know what, Scream is playing in North Beach. You guys should go see Scream. Like, yeah, we got nothing else to do. Let's go see this band. And we go watch this band, and they're amazing. And there's like, God, that drummer is amazing. What's his name? Dave Grohl.
Once Kurt and Chris decided that they were going to jump from Sub Pop, an independent label, to a major distribution company, they also decided that they needed to up their game. And unfortunately for Chad Channing, this meant finding a better drummer. Kurt and Chris were so taken aback by Dave's powerful yet controlled drumming that they mentioned to Buzz, "Damn, if we only had a drummer like that." And not long afterward, Buzz would hear from Dave. Dave would be stuck without a band.
And then we got a call from Buzz that Scream had gone to Los Angeles, and it was Pete and sister of Pete and Franz and Stahl. Their sister was like a dancer, like stripper, I guess, whatever. And they were staying in her house, and then Skeeter quit. So Dave was just like stuck in LA.
So this is usually where the woe is me, rags to riches story of Dave Grohl comes into play. Everything falls apart. Without the bassist, they can't play a show. Without playing a show, they can't make enough money to get to the next show, which gets them to the next show, which eventually gets them home. He's just stuck, and things look so bleak for Dave Grohl. And we come to the main part of this video. What was really going on in LA? Where was Dave staying? How was he not just homeless? Who are these women taking care of Dave Grohl? Dave Grohl opens up about this period in his book, which we will refer to now, and later Taylor Hawkins gives us a little more tidbits of what was going on at this Laurel Canyon house. Los Angeles was always the highlight of every tour, not just because of the obvious bells and whistles that came along with a few days in Hairspray Heaven, but because we had family there. Pete and Franz's sister, Sabrina was the most fun, bubbliest, most beautiful woman you'd ever seen, had traded the sleepy suburbs of Virginia for the glamour of LA sometime in the late 80s. Whenever we were in town, we would shack up at her place, and like an 80s video vixen, she would chaperone us around from the bright lights of the Sunset Strip to her place of business, the Hollywood Tropicana. As difficult as it may have been for Pete and Franz to see their younger sister step into a slippery pit of mud with a complete stranger, we would all go down for free drinks and collapse in fits of laughter as one by one each victim was carried off. And after the merciless slaughter, we would return to the Laurel Canyon bungalow that Sabrina shared with a few other mud wrestlers and party all night. Slumming is not a word that comes to mind. So Dave Grohl is actually having the time of his life. He has shacked up with an entire house full of Tropicana mud wrestlers, and some of them were
dancer, like stripper, I guess.
If that's not enough to make you jealous of Dave Grohl, this happens. Our gear was gathering dust in the downstairs garage of Sabrina's house, but after a week or so, I noticed something else gathering dust in that little garage, a black 1985 Honda Rebel. Having always dreamt of owning a motorcycle, I raced upstairs and inquired about who owned this glamorized mini bike. Turns out it belonged to one of Sabrina's co-workers and roommates, and she said, "Sure, take it. Just fill it up with gas and it's yours." Without a license or a helmet, which was not required in those days, I filled the Rebel's tiny tank with gas and took off through the hills, avoiding any major thoroughfares for fear of getting pulled over. I left all of my troubles behind on the floor of that cluttered living room as I wandered aimlessly through the neighborhood around Sabrina's Laurel Canyon house and spent hours driving through the winding maze of the affluent Hollywood Hills, looking down at the shimmering lights of the city below and looking up at the countless gorgeous houses nestled in the trees, dreaming of one day living in such luxury. Each one was no doubt occupied by a rock star, a movie star, a producer, or a director who had followed their dreams and somehow struck gold, and I wondered how it must feel to achieve that level of success. So what Dave Grohl often describes in interviews as a low point in his life is living with a house full of strippers who he himself describes as 5'11" supermodels. He gets to go to their places of employment, including the Hollywood Tropicana, where they wear fluorescent dental floss bikinis, and they serve him free drinks and free food. Then he gets to go home and party with them. By the way, Chris Novoselic says in the Rick Beato interview that the door of the house was taken off by the landlord because the rent was in arrearage. The rent was in arrearage because of poor money management. They were spending all their money partying, and Dave was a part of that. If that's not enough, one of the strippers, these 5'11" beautiful women, gives him a motorcycle in which he can ride the Hollywood Hills with. Does this sound like a low point in your life? If this happened to you, no, you'd have to be insane. And if that's not enough, he says he dreams of living in a house where, like one of these other people, they struck gold. He ends up striking gold because of a stupid postcard with some old redneck's autograph who was related to Elvis Presley, who he just happened to send it to Buzz Osborne, and then they just happened to play a gig together, and then Nirvana just happened to need a new drummer. Thanks to Buzz Osborne and a house full of women, Dave Grohl went from one fantasy life right into the next. However, I will give him this. Even though he treated Buzz Osborne pretty bad, and we're going to get into why Buzz sort of disdains and, well, I think a better word would be resents Dave Grohl. We're going to get into that in another video. I do believe Dave Grohl repaid Sabrina and all of her friends for the time that they took care of him. Taylor Hawkins lets it out in an interview.
And we, in some funny times in our 20s.
What do you mean about funny times?
Oh, just, we were wacky and wild, and I was a crazy man, and me and Dave used to just cruise around LA looking for chicks and everywhere else we were.
I don't know who he's talking to.
Yeah, you do. Dave had this great house on Laurel Canyon.
Telling people that on TV.
Sorry.
Talk about my little
You just said that you
bungalow.
Who does Dave know in Laurel Canyon? A house full of
dancer, like stripper, I guess.
Here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I believe. I think after making his millions with Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, Dave repaid Sabrina and all those girls by purchasing that Laurel Canyon home, putting the door back on for them, thus creating an excuse for him to come back and party with the girls.
Buzz is like, you should call Dave. And I talked to Dave, and Dave wants to get out of there. Drum cases he made it out of like 2x4s and plywood for the plane. It was like on a commercial flight. And then we picked him up at the Seattle airport, and the next night we started playing, and I was like, this is really good. It all came together, and he just never left. And he moved in with Kurt in that apartment down Pear Street.
Pear Street, right.
Yeah, what a disaster that place was.
Dave will also act like at the point he joined Nirvana, they were so poor and they had nothing and they struggled, and that's not true at all. Kurt and Chris had already been to LA. They knew that their futures were bright. When Dave chose to leave these guys who he claims were like brothers to him, he knew he was going on to something much bigger and better, which is why his mother, Virginia Grohl, gave him the advice, sometimes you got to do what's best for you. She knew it was bigger and better for him too, and she wanted her son to be successful. Nirvana was already under the management of Danny Goldberg's Gold Mountain at the point in time Dave Grohl joined the band. And he immediately begins to receive per diem. Remember we talked about per diem? Only the situation and per diem is a lot better in Nirvana than it was for Scream. The truth is, John Silva of Gold Mountain made sure that the guy's needs were met.
And then John Silva says, I want to manage you. I'm like, great. And he was working at this management company, Gold Mountain. And then John would call and like, oh, what are you guys doing? He goes, well, we're leaving for rehearsal in 5 minutes. And he'd be like, oh, good. And like hang up the phone. Basically, go to rehearsal. That's what he wanted to hear. You guys are not screwing around. You're playing a lot.
Long before Kurt would settle with DGC and get a $250,000 advance to go and record Nevermind, Gold Mountain was taking care of the guys in Nirvana, giving them each $400 a month. Plus, they were making money playing shows. And as Chris said, their rent was only $300 a month. The reason that Kurt and Dave sometimes starved was just poor money management. They'd go buy things like Super Mario Brothers games and toys that they didn't have when they were kids.
Oh, there's so many good stories. I don't even know. I mean, I just love the idea that when you join Nirvana and things start to pop and all the record companies are interested in you guys and you get like a $400 check and you bought a BB gun and a...
Such a fucking idiot, Howard. You have no idea.
I mean,
I'm
really.
That guy. When I was a kid, and you know what? I think a lot of fucking rock musicians do the same thing. Like when you grow up, my mother was a public school teacher. We never had any fucking money. Like we didn't have money for a BB gun or a fucking Nintendo or any of that shit. So when I finally got $400, to me that was like winning the fucking lottery.
Yeah.
What I did was I went and I bought all the shit I didn't have when I was a fucking kid. And then 1 week later, I'm back to the fucking corn dogs for 99 cents. Like, what the fuck was I thinking?
Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Grohl is the luckiest musician to ever live, the luckiest possibly man alive. He went from one great situation right into another. The weeks leading up to Nirvana saying, okay, Dave, you're going to be in our band now, they had already made these arrangements through Susan Silver and Alan Mentz and John Silva and Danny Goldberg. They were already on their way. As soon as Dave Grohl joined, he started getting $400 a month, plus making money, hundreds of dollars a month, from Nirvana shows. He likes to leave things sort of gray. Like, when I joined Nirvana, we were still struggling, and then very quickly afterward, things picked up. But the truth is, he went into a winning situation. And as far as Kurt not paying his rent, he did admit to Michael Azerrad he was $1,500 late on his rent. At $300 a month, that's 5 months Kurt didn't pay his rent. But you know why he didn't pay his rent? It wasn't because he didn't have the money to pay his rent. He just didn't want to. He thought his landlord was a dick, and he knew that he'd be moving on soon to bigger and better things. But as with all things Nirvana, there's two different sides to the story. Some stories say that he did go back and pay his landlord later, and other stories say that the landlord put his stuff outside and Kurt never talked to him again. I would guess that because the landlord dumped his stuff outside, Kurt said, and never paid the guy. In conclusion, Dave Grohl definitely knew hardships when he was in the hardcore act Scream. But once he joined Nirvana, it was literally Nirvana for him. And oh, by the way, if you made it this far, you'll be happy to know that, yet again, another good ending for Dave Grohl. Him and his father, James Harper Grohl, did make up, and they do have a good relationship. I believe Dave even named his daughter after his father, James Harper Grohl. Bye-bye!